Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Dackerman, the John and Jill Freidenrich Director of the Cantor at Stanford University. And we have the great pleasure today of a conversation with Stephanie Syjuco, whose work is featured in the atrium of the museum. I'm going to begin by just doing a brief introduction of Stephanie, who is an Oakland-based artist and a professor at Berkeley. And Stephanie was an undergraduate at SFAI, but she did her MFA at Stanford. So welcome, Stephanie. Thank you so much for being here today. And I look forward to the next 40 minutes of conversation with you.
Thank you, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Do you mind us starting with you telling us what it was like to study art at Stanford?
Sure. So, well, I guess, I received my master's in 2005, which actually feels quite a while ago, even though in the relative scheme of things, it isn't. Going to Stanford after having gone to a private art school, like a very small one, SFAI, was a huge kind of shock to me, actually. I hadn't ever had the experience of going to a large university, and honestly, I was intimidated and, thankful to have been accepted to the Stanford program, but also not used to the sort of the structure and rigors of, an Ivy League-ish school. And I think what it did for me, though, was it instilled this notion of my artistic practice as actually being research in a way that I think, private art schools don't necessarily have that kind of, larger context to put it in. So, through the professors I worked with, many of whom are still there, as well as just the general, academic and, rigorous notion of research at Stanford, it actually helped propel my work, I think, and it helped me take myself more seriously in a way.
That's such a great statement. I think that a lot of people don't realize how much research is part of artistic practice, that what you do before you actually begin the process of making something is so important to the making, all of the reading, the archival work. Like, what other kinds of research do you do?
Well, I guess in my practice, a lot of it is, so I acknowledge that, a lot of my research is material based as well. So, not to kind of create a distinction between, the work that happens in the studio and then the work that happens kind of more behind the scenes in terms of, doing the digging and doing the kind of, whether it's historical research or, more like a deep dive into information. But I think, one thing that I value is the ability of both those sort of two sides of an art practice to come together. So, with since I have access right now as a professor at UC Berkeley to this kind of vast field of research, and, I have to say too, being involved in these institutions, these educational institutions, grants me an access in the world that I think, many artists don't necessarily have. And so these privileges are, they're important in many ways, but I also acknowledge that, my ability to do this research actually hinges a lot on, my ability to have gotten into these systems of knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. So talking about research, you are an artist who's easy to follow because you are so active on Instagram and in social media. And I wanted to start today by talking about the DACA decision this morning from the Supreme Court, because issues of immigration have so informed your work. And as you and I discussed earlier today, the Supreme Court decision is somewhat good news, but the Supreme Court ruled against the Trump administration's decision on procedural rules rather than allowing President Obama's decision to stand. But there's an awful lot in that decision. And I think, knowing some of the work that you've made, it's interesting to talk about the work in this very live context of today.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you for bringing that up. And I think I think all of us right now are, grappling with how to both be responsive and active in the world at this moment, out, whether it's in the streets or whether it's in our communities or, outside of our kind of spaces of comfort. And then at the same time, there's this interesting kind of demand, whether it's a personal demand or even like an art world demand, to be responsive through an artistic practice of current events or recent and historical events as well. So I think, what we're showing right now on the screen are two projects that I did in 2017, which was right after the presidential inauguration, in which I had to take a very serious pause in terms of the work I was planning on making, because I felt so strongly that the what was immediately unfolding needed to be somehow addressed in the work. And I also want to say that, the studio practice for me was also running in parallel to very active work that I was doing in the world. So outside of the art world and, in protests and working with activists and, trying to kind of figure out too, like, well, where do my responsibilities lie in terms of these two worlds? So, very specifically within the art field or the gallery field, I decided I wanted to create these sort of markers of a moment, knowing that, some of the power of art spaces is that with the proper attention, they can also become repositories of cultural knowledge and conversations. I wanted to put into those spaces very specifically reflections or moments of that immediate time. So what we're looking at, again, I made literally in the weeks following the inauguration, and on the left-hand side is a portrait of an undocumented individual that I had worked with extensively during her time as my student at UC Berkeley, and tasked with both being her mentor, her her art professor, someone who is essentially, assisting her on becoming, the best that she could be in terms of her own practice in the world. It felt completely criminal that all of a sudden, due to the DACA threat or the threat of the rescinding of the very act that granted her the ability to stay in the country, that it just seemed so criminal. And I was trying to figure out a way of creating a portrait of her that would not expose her identity, because to be undocumented today is to live in a potential state of being moved at any moment, as well as I wanted to try to create a portrait that did affirm her presence, her body, her kind of self. So what it is, there's a veil on top of her, or a kind of sheer fabric that's digitally printed with the background pattern of a Photoshop file. So there's a transparency backdrop or transparency layer, which looks like this kind of gray and white checkerboard pattern. And by using that pattern, I was attempting to kind of create this metaphor of both her, the potential for her removal through the state, but also this way to protect and shield her from identity. So there's this kind of double narrative happening with her both being present and her possibility of being absent at the same time. And then on the right-hand side, which I think, is a piece that I see as kind of pairing with it, is looking backwards to a time in which Japanese Americans were interned, incarcerated, put into concentration camps through the American government. So it's a textile panel that currently hangs at the Cantor Center. And it's been up for a while, which I'm actually, really thankful for, because I think the conversation of it being in a public space, and, I think this is the entry lobby, which a lot of people pass through, it raises a very specific question, because it's the back half of the panel, the last half, is actually a kind of contracted statement. The word, when it's fully spelled out, it says, I am an American, and one can kind of decipher that. But by contracting that back end, it was for me this metaphor also of a rescinding of a promise, of a rescinding of the possibility of who gets to be either a resident or a citizen or an American in some way. And personally speaking, also as an immigrant, I've always felt that the hoops and the qualifications one must have to be here are all about this notion of how we're supposed to be either useful or at service to the idea of America. And it's as well a historical touchstone, because on the right-hand side you can see in the small black and white photo, that's my work is directly referencing the work of Dorothea Lange, who photographed in Oakland a sign that was produced by a Japanese American business owner who, on the shortly after Pearl Harbor, put up this sign outside of his store in order to, kind of prove to the larger American public that he too belonged, that he too was an American. And unfortunately, he lost his business and he was interned. So it was it's this moment that's a scar in our history, but again, happened, and so we are still threatened by these kinds of legal procedures that can take away citizenship at any moment.
And it's so relevant today to talk about that, of course, because that protection was put in place at least for a while until they can further defend the DACA order. I think it's an opportunity to talk about, I think, the role of art, the role of your art, and the role of the museum as well. And so the role of your work here, I think your work plays a lot of roles here. It's one of critique, it's one of advocacy, and it can serve its art as a catalyst to conversation, a catalyst to change. And I wonder how you think about the work in those terms, and its role in the context of these current events and what it means for it to be in public space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because, I think one can, or an artist can analyze, so an artist creates a work of art, let's just say. Artists create, I think, a lot of things that are not art as well. But when an artist creates a work of art, the context obviously shifts depending on where it's displayed, right? And also what it's displayed in conjunction with. And so when it's in a museum, such as this work at the Cantor, for me, what that means for me is that the institution has decided that this is something that they are going to hold. That they're creating a kind of contextual space for it in perpetuity. And for me, that's actually a strategic thing that I support, on my part as an artist. Obviously, because it's nice to see it in a collection or cared for, but on a larger field, it's also a kind of commitment to being a historicized event, right? So the fact that the Dorothea Lange image is also, it's in the public domain, I think, because of because it was paid for by the U.S. government. There's a kind of more open ability to access it. So it's part of our nation's, database of, formal and historical images. And in a way, I can try to argue that now, my work is being put into that conversation with it. And, I appreciate that ability, even though at the same time, I understand that institutions, especially larger ones that have been founded on, either, questionable politics or, historical economic disenfranchisements, it's a really tricky situation. And, I think artists navigate that in different ways, because similarly too, commercial galleries have their own logic that they operate in versus then, say public art commissioned by the city or the state, which also has a lot of limitations in vetting access. And then a whole much larger sphere of, the world and community spaces and, a kind of more fluid sense of art being more temporal or in more dialogue with larger groups of people. That's kind of a long-winded thing.
Oh, no, it's interesting. And, I just want to even dig in deeper to this particular context here in the atrium at the Cantor, because we can see the artwork itself hanging. In the lower right corner is a video made by Art21 of Stephanie talking about her work, which is run on a loop so that the artist's voice and presence, your presence is also there with your work. I mean, there's the sequence where you're actually talking about this work itself. Mm-hmm. And I think it creates a very particular environment for the work. In looking at this image now, we can also see Khalil Joseph's Black News through the portal down the hallway. I mean, it's a really resonant moment to consider what it means to be American, who gets to be American, all kinds of questions of immigration. Going back to your statement about research, isn't the I Am An banner sewn in the same manner as Betsy Ross's American flag? Didn't I read that somewhere, Stephanie?
Yeah, well, I was using, I researched traditional flag making sewing techniques. And so it's not complicated, but there is a way of paneling and creating the stitching of it. So I did want to, it's digitally printed textile panel. It's actually, hand sewn by myself. And in this case, yeah, by myself. Sometimes I work with assistants because honestly, the labor is impossible, to accomplish something in the given time. But in this case, it was very important for me also to have a very direct hand in the making of it. And I think it's because I also want to, put it at the forefront this, if our nation's history and the narratives and the stories that it tells itself is itself a fabrication, right? Like it's a construction. I also want to have a hand in the construction in certain ways. And I know that sounds like a very literal, kind of connection, but for me to hand make something that deals with American history is my attempt to also insert myself into a narrative that I think in some cases wants to either exclude me or not put me in the category of those that can speak for, either belonging or having a hand in the construction of American history. And that's something that I personally feel as a, as an immigrant from the Philippines and also as an Asian immigrant, in which there's this constant kind of questioning as to, where are you from originally? This notion that you are not of this place. You are automatically, suspect to being an other.
Well, the work allows us in this university setting, in this museum setting, to have incredible conversations about issues just like that with students, about the creation of American history, of narratives around American art and American museums. And I mean, the space itself is so incredible in the story it's trying to tell about American aspirations, taking this very European marble arched model of space, built in 1891 when, there was very little like this on the West Coast in the Bay Area. So I like your work here in the way that it continues this story of the creation of American identity and what it's meant for people to come both to the country, but also to this particular place in it.
Yeah. Well, one thing too that I wanted to share is that, so the word American it's still there, right? Like it literally, this panel at some point can always be displayed open. And that's a statement in itself then, that's one in which it claims that space, it sort of like holds it perhaps proudly, ostentatiously, who knows, but for this moment, the contraction of it, I think, it still holds the promise of whatever that was, but then it also has, again, that reality of its not removal, but it's rescinding or its contraction, but with the promise still there, whatever that means. What's also fascinating that I want to share is that, there's a kind of historical amnesia too about America's incursions into other countries. And so, the Philippines was one of America's early imperialist endeavors, and along with, Cuba and Puerto Rico and other areas in which, the American involvement is quite long. And there was talk in the late 1800s of actually incorporating the U.S. into, incorporating the Philippines somehow into the U.S., just like Puerto Rico is a territory. But and then, due to all sorts of like internal conflicts with governmental officials, it was deemed that, the brown people over there shouldn't be a part of us. So, this is not there's a lot of also, there's this notion that, Asian immigrants are a kind of recent addition, to the fabric of American culture, but there's so much amnesia about what was American or involved in America prior.
Yeah. And the work is so resonant because it allows us to grapple with ideas of whiteness that, we're all thinking about right now in this particular moment. And, the talking about the Philippines and whether the Philippines could become part of the United States based on this spectrum of skin color. I mean, they are stories that need to be told within settings like the museum on university campuses. So I feel like this work opens up incredible possibilities. And what I'm showing here is art history professor Marcy Kwan in the atrium space with her class, which is one of her classes, which is a survey of Asian American art that she teaches. That's a really popular class within and a really necessary class within the art history department. But I love what it does to the museum space. You know, it turns it into conversational space, a platform for conversation that is generated by the artworks themselves. And I think in this moment, as we're all watching art museums being critiqued and wondering what they will be in the future, I think that this kind of transparency, this opportunity for some of the country's most difficult conversations, that the art museum is a safe space for that.
Yeah, or let's see, a provided space. I have to give credit to you and the Cantor, because I had never thought to hang this work the way you have. You know, when I conceived of it, it actually functioned at Ryan Lee Gallery in New York as a room divider. I did that on purpose with the gallery space, in which, you know, it segmented a room on purpose as a kind of as a barrier, really, you know, or a kind of in or out of the space. And then I remember, I think you were, I forget who I was talking to directly about it, but the idea of placing it high up, you know, so prominent. I think that's where, I guess, that's where curatorial work really does, you know, create that dialogue, because that the statement you've created in this entryway lobby is not what it's not what I would have thought of, because in a way, I think the boldness of it wasn't not something I wouldn't like, but oof, you know, it was. I'm glad you suggested it, and I'm glad that it's been up for almost a year and a half now. How long has it been up for?
It's been up for, you know, it's funny because I didn't see the show at Ryan Lee, but was in the gallery in the following fall, 2018. And I was there with Debbie Wish, one of the museum supporters, and we were talking about your work, and the gallery went and got it and then laid it out on the floor of the gallery. So we first saw it lying on the floor in a flat way, and it was just so big and so powerful. And then we brought it back, and our curator of American art, Elisa Alexander, in conversation, I think you were in conversation with her around its installation. This just seemed like such a powerful place to put it because of the space that it creates. There, just as you walk into the museum, you know, it's big open space, and it's an opportunity to begin talking there and to actually hear your voice in the background, which says essentially like, let's have a conversation. You know, museums are not necessarily silent spaces for contemplation. They can also be these spaces that are really active, you know. And if we want to talk about museums as kind of catalytic space, you know, spaces where you can begin imagining change. So I think that was a lot of what we were thinking when it went up here. So,
well, yeah, I do appreciate too that, considering Stanford was the place that I, you know, had a big educational moment at. And I think that museums that are especially attached to universities are prime real estate for those conversations.
Yeah. We hope that to be true. I mean, that is very much the aspiration. So we're delighted it's here. Thank you. I'm just going to show. So just speaking of museums as catalytic spaces, like this is not your work, as you know, but so that everyone else knows, but it's work in a show that will open at the museum in the fall, in October, by Rina Kalat, who's a Mumbai-based artist, that also speaks to migration and the movement of both people and goods and now viruses around the world. But again, it's like, I think we're at this moment where we can rethink what museum space is and try to imagine what we bring to spaces. So, but speaking of the Philippines and the United States consideration of incorporating it, it's my understanding that this work is related to that. Stephanie, that and inspired by something, by Mark Twain's anti-imperialist stance and statement by him.
Yeah, so what you're showing is a work and install shot of a flag piece that I made last year. It's called "To the Person Sitting in Darkness," which sounds kind of like this very, vague or open phrase. This is for an exhibition that was curated at the Museum of Contemporary Art in St. Louis by Wassim Al-Qudairi, who's the chief curator there. And when I was talking with Wassim, we were trying to figure out a way in which we could bring my work to St. Louis, which, is this kind of a city and space, in the middle of America, and has a lot of also historical roots in terms of the American incursion in the Philippines. So in 1904, there was the St. Louis World's Fair, which was kind of like the gem and jewel of American industry and progress at the time. So to make a long story short, within all the activities around the World's Fair, which was much celebrated, were a number of kind of almost human zoos that were set up to showcase Filipino villagers who would perform their kind of traditional ways, for the American public. And these, of course, were incredibly staged. They were meant as a kind of educational tool to the general public about their new colony, the Philippines. And so, when I do these projects in other cities, I do try to create a kind of entry point where I'm not just thinking about my work as external to the space or to the context, but to somehow historically have a conversation. So I did actually 3 projects for that exhibition that dealt with St. Louis history and the Philippine American War. And it was this particular work, though, it's in the courtyard, and so we had to create they installed a professional heavy-duty flag pole in the middle. And what you're looking at is actually a flag that, although it looks like it could be incredibly contemporary, it was verbally designed by Mark Twain in 1904 in response to American imperialism in the Philippines. So Mark Twain, who also happens to be, the kind of celebrated writer from Missouri, where St. Louis is located, I wanted to take his words in which he described the American flag that we needed to have, or actually he proposed it as a flag for the Philippines, which would be to remove the white stripes and to replace it with black, and then to replace the stars with skull and crossbones. And the idea of that being, to highlight the underlying violence and disregard for the sovereignty of the Philippines at the time. So, I mean, it was a very bloody both guerrilla war and also governmental war, and the Philippines did not want to be a part of the U.S. So by creating this flag, though, over 100 years later, what I was trying to do was, again, link to American history and link to the voices that have already been here before, because I think one of the ways in which we forget as we move forward is that these, whatever effects we see can be the result of decades or centuries or much longer time periods in which people are fighting for their own emancipation, for their ability to speak for themselves. And I also wanted to use the words of a white man who is incredibly respected in Missouri, because I think too, as an artist of color, sometimes there's the expectation that I'm supposed to, hold either all the knowledge, as a person of color, as to how I'm supposed to embody, my politics. Like, I wanted to create this almost historical allyship, but also to, if anyone wanted to attack me for this flag design, I could turn around and say, oh, no, I'm sorry. This was actually designed by your wonderful hero, Mark Twain, who also felt the same way.
It's such an interesting and subversive gesture in so many ways. You and I mentioned this briefly earlier. I think it's also a great demonstration of when people justify past accounts of imperialism and oppression, any of it. They often use the language of, well, so-and-so was just a man of his time. And in fact, it's not an accurate, it's a very biased statement to make, that there were, in fact, always people who knew that discrimination was happening, oppression was happening, that these violent, indecent acts were inappropriate at this time too. So I think your use of a man of his time who has so much stature in the American imagination is just such an incredible move in this work.
I think I really thank the curator, Wesson Al-Qudairi, for really encouraging this as well, because I think the relationship sometimes between the artist and curator can either highlight or unfortunately sometimes tamp down what the artist wants to say. So in this case, and in the case of other projects, the Contemporary Museum of Contemporary Art St. Louis really actually it's Contemporary Art Museum St. Louis really helped foreground a lot of the concerns that I felt were really important.
Yeah. I'm going to move on to another flag, again, because you are such an active presence in social media. I learned yesterday, or perhaps the day before, that you are working on this other flag, this phantom flag. That was a 2017 idea or artwork that is reemerging in your studio this week.
Yeah, so I guess just some background on this. What you're looking at here is there's work in progress happening on the left-hand side. Those images are literally from yesterday, so I think it's great to see you pull things that are literally that timely. And then the images that you see on the right-hand side are of the first edition of this phantom flag, again, made in 2017 after the presidential election, and trying to pull forward these notions of, the promise versus reality. And so the sheerness and the transparency of it was a kind of metaphor about the fragility of, some of the ideals that are espoused as being permanent or rooted. And then I guess the contradictions too, that not everybody was considered a full human under, the American laws. So there's a lot of metaphors going on in there. And I guess also as some background, due to the shutdown of, COVID related activities, I have not been able to get real access to my studio, which was on UC Berkeley campus property, until fairly recently. So, my own practice has been, kind of truncated, but at the same time, it's also been really useful because I think it's helped me kind of recalibrate and rethink about, what do I want to be making in our current circumstances, both, you know, politically and also, I guess, you know, pandemically, because I think we all need to be doing that. So oddly enough, you know, the phantom flag is still relevant. You know, 3 years later, and it'll probably be very relevant again, you know, or always, despite, you know, some of the progresses we're seeing. So yeah, and oh, do you want to introduce this?
Well, but here is, so from what you're saying, I'm understanding you haven't been making these masks in your studio. You've been making them at home, probably, as
Yeah.
we've all been sheltering in place,
Yeah.
as
And
part of what's necessary right now.
yeah, I mean, so originally, what you're looking at here is actually a mass-produced, and by mass-produced, I mean they're made by workers that are employed for a local San Francisco company that called Open Editions that commissions artists to design, and then they produce, you know, a work for the public. In this case, these are masks. This was actually made quite recently, and after I had made by myself at home, almost, I think, God, over 800, it might be almost 1,000, I'm not quite sure, hand-sewn face masks. So for the first 2 months of not having access to my studio, I set myself to join many other people actually who used their, you know, just the tools and facilities that they personally had access to, which in my case was a sewing machine, fabric, and thread. And then also the skills that I'd honed as a sewer. So, you know, thankfully 25 years of, you know, my own sewing capacities in my own practice came in handy. And so for the first 2 months, I was making sewing masks full-time to be donated to nonprofits, shelters for the unhoused, radical organizations, and folks who could otherwise not afford to purchase them. And so that was, you know, through the materials that I had on hand, as well as, you know, volunteering and donating it fully. And for me, it made a lot of sense. You know, if I have the skill sets, if I have the capacity and the time, right? Because that's the other thing. You know, once I had months of exhibitions and opportunities lined up, actually through the whole year, that immediately stopped. And so I didn't want to just spend the time like kind of working on myself, which I totally get. You know, everyone needs to do what they need to do. There was this immediate, we all remember this, it's just in recent memory, there was an immediate need, you know, to create these informal or not proper protective equipment.
Not
So,
surgically, but
yeah,
helpful, nonetheless.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Useful,
And so, yeah. And so what you're seeing actually though is after those, about the first month and a half, I was approached by Open Editions to use some of my pattern designs from a project I'd worked with them earlier, to then, so that they could produce in way more quantity. So, you know, the scales of these masks, the mask production as well, you know, if you're relying on home sewers to basically outfit the millions of people that need face masks, you know, and to do it for free, that's an economic model that is completely exploitative in the end. And so I fully support businesses that are using ethical means to provide. And so what Open Editions has done is, you know, they create, they donate one mask for each mask that is purchased, and then they also hire seamstresses who would otherwise be unemployed because their factories, their small scale factories had been shut down. So, you know, I find it like a very ethical pairing that also complements, you know, my capacity to sew, you know, for a donation stream.
Thank you. Stephanie, I think we're out of time. But I want to thank you for being so generous with your time and generous with your thoughts. and tell you how lucky we feel to have your work in the atrium of the museum, something that is seen as our students come in, as our visitors come in, and that is so meaningful to so many people. And to thank you for taking on this responsive work in this crisis. It's a really unsettling time, and people are doing extraordinary things, and we all appreciate it. So thank you. We look forward to seeing you at the Cantor someday soon. And
that would be amazing. That would be amazing. And I appreciate it too, because I guess, you know, we've talked about both institutions and gallery spaces, and there is a network in place, I think, you know, to start creating the structures that we want to see. And so, you know, when I see the movements towards that, it does give me, you know, it gives me pause, and it also gives me hope that, you know, we are slowly, you know, kind of turning this wheel that's been turning in many invisible ways. And the more visible it gets, the better. So thank you.
And the more visible it gets, the faster that we can turn it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I think we're at a moment where we can make a lot more change faster. So thank you for being part of that with us.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. And I hope everyone has a good day and joins us for our next talk. Bye everyone. Bye, Stephanie.
Bye. Thank you.